Hi everyone and welcome back to Heimler's History. In this lecture I'd like to talk to you about why to the Southern mind slavery was a good idea. Oh Heimler, I am about to bring down a tweet storm of rage upon you. Calm down, hipster me. I'm not suggesting that slavery was a good idea, but the Southern population before the Civil War did, by and large, think that it was a good idea. And before you go and fly into a social media rage at me, what I'd like to try to do is explain why from the Southern perspective, slavery was, in fact, a good idea. You see, I deeply believe that you cannot critique a thing until you have seen it from the inside. And when we think about Southern slavery and all the people who believed in it, we tend to think that they were unthinking, bigoted racists. And maybe some of them were, but not all of them. They, in fact, had very good reasons for believing what they believed about slavery, and while I don't agree with their conclusions, we cannot properly understand them until we spend some time seeing the world as they did. So, let's get to it.
It's time to kick it old school.
I'm about to give you 5 reasons why Southerners believe so deeply in the institution of slavery, but I must begin by telling you that all I'm about to say here is just a distillation of a much better, much longer lecture by the venerable historian David Blight. Credit where credit is due. The first argument slaveholders use to bolster their confidence in slavery we'll call the social stability argument. Essentially, this argument was rooted in the Southern worldview, which was deeply conservative and richly organic. Their world was rooted in honor and tradition, and most important of all, the world displayed a particular order, and that order included higher and lower beings. A lion is higher than an earthworm, and a human is higher than a lion. Hierarchy was baked into the world as it was. White people were naturally superior to black people, and if someone wanted proof of that, all they had to do was look at the reality of things. Black people were slaves. White people were the masters. Therefore, they reasoned, since the world comes to us in a particular order, then anyone who does anything to try to overturn that order would be doing violence to the world as God made it. And it might surprise you to find out that the Southerners, according to their writings, were great lovers of freedom, but they wanted freedom within the given order. It's like a jazz musician who looks like he can improvise with absolute freedom, but the thing is, that musician can only improvise within the structure of the musical scales as they exist. So that's the social stability argument. Hierarchy and inequality is the way the world is, and it is the way that the world always has been. And by the way, that's true. The second argument we'll call the civilizational argument. The civilizational argument said that all the greatest civilizations in the world have always depended on slavery for their growth and flourishing. And it's true that there are some negative aspects to slavery, but for the most part, they turn out for good. I mean, how could the Greeks, they argued, have written such magnificent philosophy or stage plays without a vast population of slaves taking up the nation's manual labor? And an important pro-slavery writer named Edward Brown said, "Slavery has always been the stepping ladder by which nations have passed from barbarism to civilization." And again, he's right. The third argument we'll call the economic argument. Basically, this argument reminded everybody that slaves were property on the level of a farming tool, and a very expensive tool at that. The Southern economy rose and fell on the backs of these tools working properly, just as the Northern economy rose and fell on the backs of its factories working properly. John Henry Hammond made this argument powerfully. He said, "The means, therefore, whatever they may have been, by which the African race now in this country have been reduced to slavery, cannot affect us, since they are our property, as your land is your property, by inheritance or purchase or prescriptive right. You will say that a man cannot hold property in a man. The answer is that he can, and actually does hold property in his fellow, all over the world in a variety of forms, and as always done so. The fourth argument we'll call the racial argument. This argument grows out of the belief that there's a fundamental inequality between the white and black races, and of course, the black race, in this case, is the inferior one. And so in the minds of the Southerners who believed this, it was actually an act of charity and benevolence to hold slaves. Now listen to a slaveholder named George Fitzhugh who argued for this in a famous pro-slavery tract from 1854. Fitzhugh said in a famous passage, "The Negro is but a grown-up child and must be governed as a child. The master occupies toward him the place of parent or guardian. Like a wild horse, he must be caught, tamed, and domesticated. Men are not born entitled to rights. It would be far nearer the truth to say that some men are born with saddles on their backs and others booted and spurred to ride them." Now Fitzhugh also writes very powerfully in that same tract for the fifth argument, which we will call the biblical argument. And what he says is, if you look through all of the Bible, you will see that nowhere is slavery condemned. In fact, it is encouraged in the Bible. And it's true that there is no verse in the Bible which says, "Thou shalt not hold slaves." Even the Apostle Paul in the New Testament, in his letter to the Ephesian church, addresses slaves directly. There were some slaves who had converted to Christianity and were now part of the church. And here's what he says to them in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4. "Slaves, obey your masters." Now, if you take all of these arguments together and they were in your mind from the moment you were able to think your own thoughts and you had thoroughly metabolized them, then they would be powerful indeed. It would make sense out of the world as you saw it. If you just looked at the way things were, it was true that there was an inherited order to the world. If you just looked at the way things were, it was true that all great civilizations depended on slavery. If you just looked at the way things were, it was true that the nation's economy depended on slave labor. If you just looked at the way things were, it was true that white people were superior to black people because it was the white people who were in power over the black people. And if you read your Bible thinly, then it looked like God endorsed slavery. Now before we end, I just want to say one thing about this biblical argument. Now, the Bible doesn't need me to defend it, it can defend itself. But if the Southerners looked at their Bible and thought that the Apostle Paul endorsed slavery, they must have never read his letter to Philemon. It's the only letter in the New Testament that is dedicated exclusively to the problem of slavery. Here's the story. Philemon, a Christian, was a slaveholder, and his slave, Onesimus, had escaped from Philemon's house and found his way to the Apostle Paul, under whose ministry he became a Christian. And so the Apostle Paul writes this short letter to his friend Philemon, puts that letter into the hand of Onesimus, his former slave, and sends him back to deliver the letter. And of all the magnificent things that Paul says in this letter, maybe the most significant is his instructions to Philemon about Onesimus. He says to Philemon, "You must receive Onesimus back as a brother." And do you see what he did there? He robbed the slaveholder of any means by which he could see his former slave as a subordinate. No, they are brothers, which means they are equals, and equals cannot enslave one another. And with that, the whole biblical argument for slavery falls to the ground. Now, there are equally good responses to all of the other arguments as well, but we'll have to save those for another time because we are now out of time, and so I will see you next time.